We need to talk a little bit about threats like these from Eurovision's organizers towards this year's artists, but mostly about some new details regarding the vote that took place at the last General Assembly, and how they relate to this UN report, which accuses Eurovision of sheltering Israel from accountability. There is a lot to unpack here. Some of it is quite specific to the EBU's internal procedures. I'll do my best to visualize everything I can, but regardless, I'm quite confident that what we're about to talk about will be of interest to you. So to start off, a few weeks ago, we saw the EBU respond to some comments that were made by Sweden's artist Felicia, who said in an interview that despite agreeing to go to Eurovision, she doesn't think that Israel should be taking part and that she wants to make sure that they don't win. Israel's broadcaster Khan made a complaint to the EBU. They then followed up by contacting the Swedish broadcaster SVT to remind them that participants are not allowed to politicize or instrumentalize the contest and therefore create controversies. Now, we've already seen what happens to people who try to justify their participation in Eurovision by making any kind of comment about Israel or showing gestures of solidarity with Palestinians. They get a target on their back from the Israeli delegation, like many of the 2024 artists, or they get censored or threatened by the EBU, like the Spanish commentators from 2025. None of this happened with artists who showed solidarity with Ukrainians. The EBU considered those gestures to be humanitarian, not political. With all that in mind, it's my opinion, at least, that if you don't think that Israel should be there, then neither should you. Because they're going to be warmly welcomed to the stage in May, after starting more wars than there were around this time last year, killing thousands more civilians, and potentially leading us towards a global energy crisis. And you will be expected to keep your mouth shut. But seeing how swiftly the EBU felt the need to step in 2 months before the contest even started, it reminded me of one of the issues from 2 years ago, where instead of blaming the artists, the EBU had attempted to deflect the blame off of them and onto the union itself, because they were facing much of the backlash around the inclusion of Israel in Eurovision, which was not a decision that they made. And 2 years later, the EBU will waste no time in going after artists and accusing them of politicizing the contest, while at the same time saying nothing about the former head of Austria's broadcaster making a trip to Israel to meet with the president, specifically to ensure that they wouldn't be excluded from the next contest. The EBU never made any kind of statement or condemnation towards ORF. Apparently, it's not political when a politician is exerting influence on a foreign broadcaster, as if that's like a normal thing that happens under any circumstances. So as much as I think that artists like Felicia are making a mistake, the EBU is in no position to be going after her or any other artist who is giving an honest answer about their decisions, when they have nothing to say about politicians getting close to the contest, not even ones who are directly implicated in a genocide case. Which brings me to the main topic that I want to focus on. It does mean that we have to revisit some events that a lot of people have put behind them, but I felt it was important to get this information out there because I am pretty sure that this is a first in Eurovision's history, and yet I've seen no mention of it in Eurofan media. Back in January, I had the opportunity to participate in a virtual press conference with Eurovision Song Contest director Martin Green. They were holding the press conference mainly to promote the 70th anniversary tour, which was cancelled not long after that, but in their invitation, it explicitly said, Martin is also available to take all and any questions you might have about the Eurovision Song Contest. Nothing is off limits. Now, I have a lot of questions for the folks that are running Eurovision nowadays, as I'm sure many of you do as well. But this is not an interview. You have to go in with the assumption that you will get one shot to ask a question, and sometimes you don't even get that much. And so I prepared a few that I felt were quite important. There was one that I put right to the top of my list because honestly, I didn't trust that other media would ask about it. Last October, UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese presented a report to the United Nations General Assembly that was titled Gaza Genocide, a Collective Crime, The purpose of that report was to illustrate how Israel's violence is enabled by third parties. It mostly focuses on countries and their governments, but it also talks about the role of cultural platforms. The specific part of the text says, Israel has been sheltered from accountability in courts as well as in global fora, with institutions preventing its deserved expulsion both from sports, e.g. Paris Olympics, FIFA World Cup qualifiers, FIBA, Davis Cup, and cultural events, Eurovision, Venice Biennale. Now, this is significant because with every other political matter, the EBU has always tried to claim that they're not taking sides. In this case, they can't do that. They're being called out specifically for taking sides by a UN-appointed human rights lawyer. That lawyer, Francesca Albanese, has become somewhat of a central figure around the discussion of international law and how it impacts Israel and Palestine. And often, she provides a lot of clarity about what that law does say and doesn't say.
Do you believe that Israel has a right to exist?
Israel does exist. Israel is a recognized member of the United Nations. Besides this, there is not such a thing in international law like a right of a state to exist. Does Italy has a right to exist? Italy exists. What is enshrined in international law is the right of a people to exist. So the state is there, the state of Israel is there, is protected as a member of the United Nations. Does this justify the erasure of another people? Hell no. Not 75 years ago, not 57 years ago, surely not today.
Now, her priorities are mostly with respect to human rights, not entertainment or their internal procedures. So I wouldn't expect her to have the same depth of knowledge for exactly how Israel has been treated in the last few years. But I also don't think that she would go around this type of accusation carelessly. If she was going to put Eurovision in her report, it would be for a good reason. And we're about to see what that reason is. So when it was my turn to ask a question, I explained the report to Martin and what it was accusing the contest of. I also backed that up by listing a number of international bodies that have declared that Israel is committing a genocide to ensure that he understood the weight of those allegations. And I asked him how the union would respond to it. His response was, "We respectfully disagree." What this is about in the wider lens is, should global sporting cultural events be used to platform the geopolitical differences and issues going on in the world? Most people, and most of our members, believe that they should not. To put it another way, are the artists singing and the broadcasters behind them responsible for the actions of their governments? Now, some people will say yes, we believe they are not. The membership obviously believes this as well, because they voted on the issue. 65% of them wanted us to continue the way we were. If you'd like to read the full transcript of his responses, they're in the comment section. I'm just focusing on the most relevant parts. But to summarize, after he says that the union disagrees, he pivots to a philosophical debate about platforming geopolitical differences. That's not what the report is concerned with. The report is saying that Eurovision is sheltering Israel from accountability. If that's not the case, then he should be explaining why not. And in his answer, quite ironically, he doesn't even say Israel. And so he dodged the question. But he also brought up the General Assembly vote and how that was an example of how the membership agrees with these ideas. That allowed me to ask a follow-up question, and so we'll talk about that and we'll come back to the report later. To briefly recap what happened in December, in case you don't follow this as closely as some folks do, the membership of the EBU voted on a series of rule changes for the 2026 contest, not about platforming geopolitical differences. Most of these new rules were developed in response to complaints around Israel's results, which for the last 2 years have been backed by an aggressive government-funded ad campaign. Getting a high televote score allowed the media to claim that the public strongly supports Israel despite their violence, even though every other opinion poll conducted by professionals is saying the exact opposite. At the time, it was reported that 8 members requested a separate ballot on the participation of Israeli broadcaster Khan, and some reports said that a vote could be forced if it's backed by at least 5 members. They had more than that. But the ballot that was presented to the members made it so that if the new rules were accepted, there would be no further vote on participation, which led to speculation that the union had violated its own rules. So I asked Martin about this and how that reflected the union's democratic values, which he was just praising. He quite confidently said, "That's not what happened." Every rule and statute that the EBU has was followed, and the membership made its democratic decision. Clearly, there are members who have disagreements with each other, but the vast majority made a clear decision. He also said that he wasn't the authority on what the EBU's statutes are, but suggested that I get in touch with the Secretariat to get clarity on that issue. Now, the amount of effort that went into combing through documents and having several conversations with people who knew what happened at the General Assembly really didn't justify what I came up with in the end, which is that this came down to an argument of technicalities. Real sexy. So rather than getting bogged down in the details, here's the gist of what I've learned and what I can prove. First and foremost, the EBU confirmed that it did receive a request for a secret ballot from these 8 members, but refuted that the request was specifically to vote on Khan's membership. Now, it is true that the letter from those 8 broadcasters didn't explicitly request a vote on Khan, but among the people that I spoke to, their reasoning was that there was a clear precedent that was established in the July meeting that a vote on Khan was to be expected. This was supported by statements that the EBU told Reuters, as well as the documents that the members received before the meeting, including an invitation from the president and the item on the agenda, which said participation, not rules. Now, the specific bylaw that they invoked also said that they could request a secret ballot before or during the meeting. And in the discussion that was held before they actually voted, multiple people who had the floor reminded the president of their request to vote on Khan. And after the ballot was introduced to the members, someone had actually raised how unusual it was to have just had this discussion that had no bearing on how they would actually proceed with the vote. Therefore, there is no way that the leadership didn't know what those broadcasters were asking for. They chose to ignore it. Now, there was something else that kept coming up when I was communicating with the EBU, including when Martin was responding to my question. We were speaking to the entire membership throughout the summer and beyond. It was absolutely clear that the majority of the membership did not favor a vote that was an in-out vote. They wanted to see if we could deal with this in different ways. And so that is eventually why we put the package of measures on. Okay, well, by this logic, there were only 10 members who had called for Russia to be excluded from Eurovision in 2022. But it didn't take 2 years, several meetings, and a rules vote to be struck down first for that to happen. It took a day. If the procedures say that only 5 members are needed to request a vote and 8 ask for it, then it doesn't matter what the majority think. In fact, it's in everyone's best interests to go ahead with the vote so that you can get their real opinion about that one thing on paper, unless you're afraid of them voting for an outcome that you don't want. And if some members are worried about the political consequences, which we're clearly pretending isn't the real reason why the independent broadcasters didn't want to vote on Israel, that's why a secret ballot would protect them so that they could make a decision without it having to be in line with their government's politics. But because they made it needlessly convoluted, folks like Martin Green get to claim that this rules vote answers all kinds of questions about Israel and about platforming geopolitical differences. So, did the EBU violate its own rules? It's unclear, because we can't tell if they were obligated to carry out the vote and still chose not to, or if the president can deny the request at their own discretion. When I was looking through the statutes with a friend, the conclusion that both of us came away with was that it's the second one, but that would still mean that they deliberately ignored a request from 8 members. And neither of these possibilities say anything about this being a truly democratic result. Could there be another explanation? Maybe, but I have my doubts, because when I asked for clarity on the bylaw, the EBU just reiterated the outcome of the vote for a third time, which says everything that I need to know about their real interest in honoring that bylaw. But since they keep stressing the outcome of the vote that they actually had, let's finally revisit it, because This is by far the most absurd way to explain why the contest is not in fact protecting Israel from accountability. Okay, so there are two questions at hand. Should the package of new rules be accepted, and should Israel be excluded from the 2026 contest? If these questions were asked independently, then there would be four possible outcomes, which you can see here. Now, we already know that by coupling these two questions together and by conditioning the second vote on the first, they guaranteed that this last option was ruled out completely. That alone made the probability of Israel staying in the contest that much greater, because 2 out of the 3 possible outcomes leave them untouched. Of course, Martin says that they gave clear instructions to the members to vote no on the updated rules if they wanted to proceed to the vote on participation. But in order for that to be a truly fair decision, the members would need to see the incentives of voting yes or no on the rules as equal, when in reality, they simply are not. Apart from bringing juries back to the semifinals, all of the new rules were because of Israel's conduct in previous contests, specifically because members felt that their government-funded ad campaign led to a disproportionate televote result. After the 2025 contest, the EBU's own fact-checking service determined that the delegation cooperated with the government. That was already against Eurovision's existing rules, and if you have any doubts, you can see for yourself. On the Eurovision website, there's a truncated version of the contest's rules, which are made to be easier to read for the general public. Now, if you were to go there right now, you would find the updated rules, which are for the coming contest. We're more interested in what the rules had said for these past 2 editions. The official rules are in a longer document with much more detail, but both versions have the exact same wording. The ESC shall in no case be politicized and or instrumentalized and or otherwise brought into disrepute in any way. Since Khan was never penalized for collaborating with their government, there are only 2 possibilities here. The EBU chose not to act against them when they could have and should have, or this rule, which as far as I can tell is the entire backbone of the contest's non-political argument, is useless. Because the language is so open to interpretation that direct government interference doesn't apply somehow. But of course, their solution is to create more rules, because they clearly care so much about exactly what they say, and wouldn't ever choose to interpret them broadly when one member is definitely breaking them, and narrowly when 8 members are trying to follow them. Now, it's not like that rule was never used against any other country for things like gestures of solidarity, but the rules are supposed to apply to everyone. If another country were to get ideas from what Israel was doing and also think about doing a collab with their government on a propaganda project, the new rules would make it harder for them to do so. In theory, at least. And so, obviously, it was in the broadcaster's best interests to vote yes. But in exchange, they wouldn't be able to hold Khan accountable if they felt the need to do so. And if that wasn't any clearer, Martin himself wrote a letter ahead of the vote in which he described the changes as the most extensive review of our voting framework, needed to strengthen trust in the fairness of the contest, a series of significant changes for 2026 that reinforce transparency, accountability, and neutrality. In other words, vote for this one. To be like, you really could have voted no if you felt that strongly about it, is completely disingenuous. Because voting no means risking an outcome where nothing changes and no one is held accountable. So this is the example that Eurovision's director chose to answer the question, are you sheltering Israel from accountability? This vote took place 6 weeks after this report was published, and it does not challenge the findings of that report. It proves them to be true. There was no logical reason for these votes to be conditioned on one another. And by ignoring the request for individual votes, they manufactured the outcome to prevent Israel's expulsion. So look, I understand that this kind of thing is not on everyone's radar. I also know that fans are tired of the bullshit, and they just want the contest to be fun again. I don't blame anyone for feeling that way. But at the very least, I hope that people remember this the next time we hear Eurovision's lore explained to us, about how it was born out of a need for unity after World War II. You know what else was? The United Nations. And now, Eurovision is in their documents in a report that doesn't consider them to be passively involved or caught in the middle like they tend to claim they are. They see them as sharing responsibility in what has been described as a genocide by a UN Commission of Inquiry, Doctors Without Borders, the International Association of Genocide Scholars, Amnesty International, and countless other human rights organizations, including those in Israel. And what do they have to say about that? We respectfully disagree. We, the TV people, who are more concerned with muzzling artists than we are about heads of state lobbying our members, respectfully disagree with the UN-appointed human rights lawyer. Truly pathetic, in my opinion. But this is just the organization. What should happen next is for the broadcasters to explain themselves as well. How having the event that they pay for being called out by the UN for whitewashing a genocide fits in with their mandate. I'm not going to be the one to ask them because I wasn't even planning on doing this. I was just following a lead, and this is where it led me. But I hope that others are up to the task to get some answers, because at a surface level, it would seem like the institutions that run this contest have absolutely no idea what politicization means. The reality is they do know. They're not stupid. But until they are forced to acknowledge that the contest is a soft power tool and it will never be apolitical, they'll continue to play dumb. And they'll go after people in the spotlight, like Felicia or Eric Sade, Bambi Thug, Yolanda, Nemo, whoever. And so let's see it, because we have this enormous ecosystem of Eurovision fan media, and you would think that if they're so devoted to the contest, then it would include all of it, not just the parts that make us feel good. But of course, I also know that there are plenty of people who really don't care, and others who prefer not to think about anything that would make them feel guilty about enjoying the contest. I'm not trying to reach those people anymore. I'm trying to reach people who see the bigger picture. And I can only hope that that includes you. I'll see you next time.